Welcome to Paranormal Yakker. You are invited to join me, your host, Stan Mallow, each week when I interview a different guest of note in their respective field. The unexplained, the mysterious, the macabre, UFOs, ghosts, Bigfoot, psychic phenomena. We explore them all on Paranormal Yakker. Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yakker. My guest on today's show is David Shi. He is a spiritual worker and folk magic practitioner who engages in traditional North Asian forms of shamanism. I'll be talking with David about his book, Spirit Voices, The Mysteries and Magic. How, David, would you define shamanism, and does North Asian shamanism differ from shamanism practiced by other countries? If so, how do they differ?
I'm going to be a little bit controversial in how I define it because it's very much opposed to what a lot of people think shamanism is. The best way to start off that we would define a shaman is a person who was chosen by specific spirits when they were born to act as the bridge between the human world and the spirit world, in which the spirits who chose them empower them to do two things. One is transpossession, and two is spirit flight. And the reason why I say that this definition is controversial is because the first part of this definition is that a shaman is someone who is chosen by spirits when they are born, aka they are born to be a shaman. It is not something that one can study. It is not something that one can become. And at the same time, if one is chosen, they cannot escape that. This is something that they have to do, or they have to act upon in their life. And the word shaman actually comes from North Asia. It came to the English language actually from Russian Siberia, from one of the tribes there that uses the word shaman, or saman as it's pronounced. And so for that reason, we have a very specific definition, which you just heard, for the word shaman. So actually the regions of North Asia, which encompasses several different countries actually, but those regions and those specific cultures are actually considered to be the home cultures of shamanism relative to what that word actually means. And because of just, migration and contact, the shamanism that developed in this area actually did spread to a good chunk of the world, as far east as Korea, as far west as Hungary, and even northern Scandinavia. But that's kind of where it ends. The word shaman today is, many people like to use it to describe any indigenous spiritual tradition around the world. And that's actually incorrect usage, only because that's basically the result of the British and Spanish empires. They learned this word from the Russians, who first brought this word to the West. And the British and Spanish empires, as they were going around the world, they didn't want to use one of their own words for a holy or a priest. And they didn't want to use that to describe any of the spiritual elders across in the cultures they encountered, because they didn't want to put them on the same level. So what's a foreign word that we know that's kind of, spiritual? They landed on the word shaman. That legacy continues today, where people describe anything that is indigenous, anything that looks quote unquote tribal, as shamanism, when really that is incorrect. And I'm going to be the first one to say that the vast majority of Native American traditions across the Americas technically are not shamanism. A few are, especially those in the Pacific Northwest. They very much are, but the vast majority are not. The vast majority of Native tribes do not use that word. Some of their elders have even been in contact with people from North Asia and discovered it's really not applicable. So hence, that's one of the reasons why I decided to write this book, and why I'm talking to folks here and everywhere, is to sort of provide a little bit of that background.
I'm pleased that you did. And before I ask my next question, David, the medal around your neck has my curiosity, so I have to ask you, what is it?
The easiest way to describe it is a shamanic mirror. So what that means is every North Asian tribe practices their shamanism a little bit differently by region, but one aspect that's kind of universal within that region is actually the use of a mirror. Most people think of a drum, and yes, they all use drums, but a mirror is kind of another defining trait of the different traditions of shamanism in North Asia. At the very basic level, it is for protection. It's used for protective purposes. is the mirror, like many other objects that we use in our shamanic traditions, is considered an enlivened object. It does actually have a soul in it, that when we created it, one of our spirits is actually living in this mirror. So it acts much more and much deeper than just protection. In some ways, it acts as a spiritual battery in which any type of energy or blessings that we receive that doesn't get used immediately gets stored in here. We can use it for a number of different ceremonies. We can use it for cleansing. We can use it for blessing. We can use it for, in a way, there's this one colleague of mine that describes it as a shaman's Swiss Army knife, in that it's very versatile in how you can use it. But even when we're not actively using it, it is acting like an armor of sorts.
When, David, did you first become aware of your own ancestral traditions? Did you grow up in a family that practiced it, and by doing that, you were made aware of it? Or was it something you pursued and learned on your own in order to connect with your roots?
The short answer is the second one. But it's actually really funny because I grew up in a family that was very atheist. So much of North Asia, late 20th century, became communist in one way or another. And my family grew up in a communist environment, which pretty much taught that all spirituality, religion, whatever, was all superstition. And if anything, even though my parents, my household was not communist, some of that culture kind of still remained in that they very much thought of themselves as people of science. They, like to pursue engineering, physics, that kind of thing. So anything that was, spiritual, even metaphysical, they considered it to be quote unquote uneducated folks stuff. And I pretty much lived a large part of my childhood like that. How I got acquainted with this, tradition that I'm currently practicing is actually, for me, it started off with ancestral dreams in which, I had dreams in which ancestors would come and, speak to me sometimes. And even around, puberty, they would come and they would also, what I recognize now is they also struck me with what we call spiritual sickness or shamanic sickness, if you will. I didn't realize what it was at the time, and it's kind of been a recurring thing. And it was only when I was maybe in my 20s, starting like throughout my entire 20s, actually, I started to get a better idea of what was going on because I was able to talk to people who were spiritually inclined. And through the direction that I gotten from my ancestors, what I could interpret, plus the spiritual practitioners I had contact with, I was able to talk to people who were of traditional shamanic lineages across both Mongolia and Korea, who really kind of outlined for me what was going on with me and helped me to, figure out my path. So that's kind of been how things have developed for me.
What are the duties, the responsibilities of a shaman?
It's very much tied to a community. So the purpose, the reason why shamans even exist is to help ensure balance within a community and within community members and between the community and the spirits. So with the shamans, nowadays people go to shamans in the similar way as when people might want to go to a doctor, but for spiritual reasons. Something's going wrong in their life. They want to figure out what might be going on, why they have a string of bad luck, why do people feel like they're cursed? Because back in the day, before the 20th century, the shaman had to act like a doctor, treating both spiritual and physical illnesses. The shaman basically, in a way, acts like a doctor in that sense. We diagnose what might be going on in people's lives. We help them determine if their condition is a spiritual condition or if it's just a physical condition that doesn't require spiritual work or intervention, and help people heal better that way. In ancient times, shamans have served as advisors to, political leaders. Genghis Khan actually famously had 2 shamans by his side at all times. The purpose of shamanism is really balance and coexistence between humans and each other, between different communities, as well as with their spirits. And oftentimes where shamans really come in useful is if a community has disturbed or upset their own spirits, whether it's ancestral spirits or the spirits of the land that they're on, in which case the shaman acts as a mediator. What kind of that implies, and what I often say is the difference between a shaman and, let's say, a witch, is that the trope for witches is that they kind of live outside of society and people kind of like go see them if they dare. Whereas shamans cannot exist like that. So they have to exist with a community. Sometimes they'll have their own bubble within a community, but it has to have a community. One of my elders actually has said to me that if a shaman does not have a community to serve, the energy and the spirits will be too overwhelming for them. It will actually make the shaman lose their sanity.
I'm fairly sure, David, that most people are not aware that North Asia is the place where shamanism began, and you did address that previously. Is it possible to elaborate a bit on that? And what do you think is the energy of what was going on there that it was born?
I think you touched on a great point. Shamanism, like all spiritual practices, emerged because there was a need for it. Now, in terms of the North Asia regions, I guess to define what that region means. So North Asia kind of broadly encompasses Russian Siberia, Mongolia, the entire country, the Manchuria region, which is really northeast China and southeast Russia, as well as bits of Central Asia. Shamanism is said to have developed somewhere in that region. Some people say southern Siberia near the Mongolia border. Some people say in northern Mongolia. Some people say like in the Altai Mountains, which is a little bit to the west, but it's all kind of generally like they're all neighboring areas. And, you know, the funny thing is that shamanism developed, I would almost hypothesize as the reason it developed is because the quote unquote gods of Northern Asia, for one reason or another, are a little bit less active in human affairs, especially compared to some of the pre-Christian European gods who were very active in human affairs. The ones in North Asia were a little bit less so. But at the same time, as humans, part of our cosmology is that our souls do come from the spirit world. And so there is a need for us to maintain health within our spiritual body, within our spiritual self. And it's very hard to do that without, you know, a connection to the spirit world. And without active gods helping to fulfill that role, what has happened is that people within North Asia, as with indigenous peoples all over the world, started working more with their ancestors. They started working more with, you know, the spirits of the land around them. But as these practices of just, you know, working with spirits, whether it's through prayers or giving offerings, the relationships start getting deeper and deeper to the point where people started to be able to talk to these spirits, whether it's ancestral spirits or whatever, through dreams or through trance states. And that's something that has developed in many parts of the world. But culturally, something happened within North Asia in which the spirits, especially the shamanic ancestral spirits, started to almost want to say they want to be a little bit more demanding in the counterpart relationships with their descendants, to the point where they would choose specific descendants to essentially act as their counterpart. So shamanism is all about partnership between the shaman and their spirits. And I would almost describe shamanic ancestral spirits as, you know, those like curmudgeon, old, crotchety like ancestors who like, you have to listen to what I do. They're like that even when they're dead. They choose specific descendants to specifically work with and develop this relationship where they engage in transpossession, where they engage in that spirit flight. The shaman spirits escort the shaman's soul into the spirit world to do things there. And so this was a practice that, or a tradition that developed over time. And one of the defining features, as I mentioned, was that they are chosen by specific spirit. It's very different from spirituality in, let's say, like pre-Christian Europe or even other parts of the world where it's, you know, a lot of people go to a temple and worship a god. It's not so much that as much as it is that every family works with different spirits depending on what spirits are attached to those specific bloodlines. So there might be some overlap in spirits between different families because they might be related in ancient times, but this is kind of how that develops specifically.
What, David, are the differences between an ancestral shaman spirit and a local land spirit?
When I say a shamanic ancestral spirit, basically it refers to ancestors who are now spirits who were shamans when they were living. So it's actually a whole cycle where that when a person is chosen to be a shaman, they work with their shamanic ancestral spirits. And when that shaman passes away, they then become an ancestral shamanic spirit. And then they choose one of their descendants to then be the shaman. So essentially, I'm working shamanically with my spirits. When I pass away, my my soul will choose a descendant to work with in the same way. In a way, that is what separates a shamanic ancestral spirit from other ancestral spirits. But with regards to land spirits are actually they're the only spirits that are indigenously originally from the physical world. They're not from the spirit world, they're from the physical world. And they are spirits who reside essentially in nature. They are the guardians of different parts of nature. So every mountain will have its own spirit or set of spirits, rivers, lakes, oceans. And with land spirits, they are not necessarily tied to the ground. The entire physical world is essentially their kingdom. So they almost say up into the land spirits go up into the atmosphere and down below into the magma of the earth. Land spirits are spirits that people have learned to work with, one, because we're neighbors and that humans kind of live on the land, but two, because land spirits are the only spirits that are indigenous and native to the physical world. Even our souls are not, because our souls are from the spirit world, but land spirits, they're originally from this world. So they, in a way, serve as a conduit that helps connect us to our ancestral spirits. And then our ancestral spirits then are able to connect us to higher divine powers above. The funny thing is, when I describe things that way, the best way, it's not the same relationship, but I almost tell people in the sense of, think of Catholic saints. They kind of work with people on behalf because they can't reach the higher powers above. That's kind of the role that land spirits and then shamanic ancestral spirits and so on, that it's a similar kind of role and relationship.
Would a shaman communicate differently with each type of spirit, or is the method of communication done the same way?
Generally the same way, but keeping in mind that each spirit does have their own personality. We communicate them differently in the sense that we communicate with other humans differently. Some you have to tread a little bit more carefully, some are a little bit more relaxed. Generally, we're able to communicate with our ancestral spirits because the connection that we have with the land spirits helps kind of bring everything together. And in some cases, we're able to connect with spiritual entities that are even, I guess, hierarchically higher than our ancestral spirits. It depends on which one. So, for example, for myself, being born and raised in the US, I talk to a lot of people who work with, let's just say, pagan gods, for example. And I found a lot of those pagan when I go to their spiritual activities, I find that their gods and their deities are relatively accessible in that I can communicate with them to a certain degree, which is not something that I can say necessarily for deities or gods in North Asia or other parts of the world. And I think that comes down to those specific gods making themselves more available to humans. Whereas in North Asia, because they're not as available, we rely on our ancestors basically coming down to us. I think it's with other parts of the world, with their gods, if their gods are more accessible, they kind of voluntarily come down to us. And so we're able to communicate with them and we're able to reach them. But in other instances, the furthest we can reach are the ancestral spirits.
Previously in the interview, David, you had mentioned that without the spirits and their blessing, a shaman cannot exist or function. And in order for the shaman to connect with spirit, they have to be in a trance state. How, David, I'm curious to know, does one get into a trance state and do it safely?
Well, that's a little bit of a tough question, but basically, a trance state at its core is a shift in conscious. It's almost like you put yourself in a state that's between waking and dreaming. And for people who are chosen to be shamans, this is actually something that comes easier for non-shamans, because when our ancestral spirits come, the sheer energy and vibration almost just kind of puts us in almost like a haze. And that's kind of that trance state that happens. For people who want, and it's possible for non-shamans to engage in a trance state for their own spiritual well-being, it's a little bit more difficult. And that's why things like, when people say, listen to certain instruments or, drumming or certain types of music, that kind of, in a way, kind of sets the brainwaves to make that trance state a little bit more easy to be induced. What I would say in terms of doing it safely is that when someone is in a trance state, that actually does put you into access with the spiritual realms, and it can facilitate communication with trusted spiritual entities to do any type of magical work. Someone who's a non-shaman, if they have spirits, any type of spirits, guardian spirits or whatever that they trust, that they work with and have full faith in, they can engage with those spirits to then do magical work. And I think that's what a lot of magical traditions around the world do. The way that a shaman engages in trance state is we use specific instruments, whether it's a drum or a jaw harp, that's similar to the mirror, actually has one of our spirits in it, so that when we do play it, it immediately summons the spirit and we're able to immediately snap into a trance state. And more often than not, the spirits then kind of possess us. If we're already in a little bit of a trance state, that makes it easier for our spirit to possess us, in which case then we kind of fully fall into a deep trance state where sometimes we don't, sometimes, it's almost like we're taking a back seat in our mind while the spirit kind of uses our body for whatever purpose. So that's kind of a description of what a trance state is. Again, I want to emphasize it is possible for non-shamans to engage trance states safely if they want to just shift that conscious and then work with the spiritual entities that they trust. That's how a lot of people essentially perform magical works.
In what ways, David, can someone who is not a shaman use techniques employed by shamans to enhance and benefit aspects of their life that may not be going in the direction they hoped it would?
The way that we would describe shamanism versus like other spiritual practices is we almost see the work that shamans do as the equivalent of maybe a surgeon, but you don't need to be a surgeon to do general first aid or even find over-the-counter medicines for when you get sick. Even before necessarily calling the aid of a shaman, or for someone who's not a shaman, the best things that they can do for themselves, for their spiritual health and spiritual development, is cleansing themselves on a regular basis using whatever spiritual cleansing techniques that they're familiar with. I talk about some from North Asia in my book, but that basically ensures that the spiritual body is clean and there's no attachments or pollution or just dirt, spiritual dirt that's on you. And then the other thing is to give offerings to the spirits that are with you and around you. And if nothing else, everyone has ancestral spirits who are watching over their descendants, and everyone lives on the land. So people can give offerings to the land spirits around them as well. Essentially, these two things form the backbone of spiritual health and spiritual development. And what I tell people, especially if they're already within a spiritual or magical tradition, is that once they start giving offerings to their ancestors or to the land spirits around them, by their connection to the spirituality that they're already working in gets stronger. Even people who are within pagan traditions, if they do start cultivating their spiritual health and giving offerings to ancestors and land spirits, their connections with their own gods gets stronger, gets clearer, it gets more impactful. And the reason for that is because by doing these things, they are essentially clearing the brush and clearing the obstacles that would block their connection with higher powers. And this is something I recommend for everyone, even if they're not engaging in shamanic practice, even if they're not of North Asian descent. That is just good general practice to the same degree as it's good to take vitamins. In that sense, I think those two are really the foundation for any other practice. If people want to learn more about what they do in North Asia, they have spiritual cleansing techniques that they do. They have a way of giving offerings in a ceremonial way, and also they strengthen their ancestral bonds as well. We actually have another concept, if I to go on a real quick tangent, is we actually have a concept of household fire spirit, in which every family bloodline has a fire spirit, in which if people do fire ceremonies to feed that fire, that strengthens their bloodline and also improves overall general protection, luck, health, and spiritual connection as well. I mean, that's a very not just North Asian, that's a very Asian specific concept. It's actually equivalent to the Chinese concept of the kitchen god, but that concept is very Asian specific, but it kind of goes into the same line of the feeding your ancestors and feeding the connection to your ancestors.
You spoke about offerings, people giving offerings. What type of offerings are you referring to? Could you give me an example of what you mean?
Offerings, most of the time come in the form of food or drink that people leave for the spirits. Within North Asia, we use milk very commonly because milk is considered to be an essence of life, and at the same time, the essence of motherly love, because it's what mothers feed children with. Milk is used very common there. Every culture kind of has their own, habits of what they give as offer. Basically, think of them as gifts. They're basically gifts to the spirit. For a lot of ancestors, that might entail, what a particular ancestor might have enjoyed in life. Oftentimes within Asia, we give grains as well. In North Asia, they don't have as much rice. They use barley more, but basically something along the lines of barley or rice or wheat. Basically, it represents food, but because it's a lot of different small things, it's considered to represent abundance and prosperity as well. I know in other parts of Asia, people use fruits a lot. Many cultures around the world, they might use different types of alcohol, whether, it's vodka or whiskey or rum. In North Asia, they use vodka a lot, unsurprisingly. For a lot of ancestral spirits, food and drink of some kind are considered appropriate offerings. Some cultures, actually a lot of people today, use water, which is better than nothing. It's still, it's still considered an offering if there's nothing else. For land spirit offerings, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated in that this is where it's really good to know the land that you are on. If you are in a culture where there is already a cultural habit of giving offerings to land spirits, they'll recognize a lot of the offerings, such as, food or drink. But for a lot of places that had a little bit of a rough history, alcohol may not be an appropriate offering for that particular land. So this is where some research and some familiarity with the land is important. For land spirits, if nothing else, land spirits love treasure. Anything that kind of resembles treasure, whether it's, crystals or little bits of, silver or gold, are considered great offerings for land spirits as well. So that's a kind of a brief outline of offerings.
Where would you suggest people leave these offerings? A room in their house, in the garden, or is any specific location recommended to leave the offering?
This really comes down to, different cultural practices. If people maintain an altar, then leaving offerings on the altar is appropriate because the spirits are familiar that that's where, offerings are placed. That's where spiritual activity is conducted. When you're outside, where for liquid offerings, we actually sprinkle them. We like to sprinkle it if we're giving it to ancestors or even other sky spirits. We normally throw them towards the sky. For land spirits, we basically sprinkle it on the ground. And then food offerings, if it's something like grains, it can be kind of scattered as well. So anything that is, able to be scattered, we kind of scatter. For any, whole offerings that are, like a dish or whatever, we don't use a lot, but sometimes we do. Then it's generally placed in a sacred area. Like it can be under a tree if we're doing spiritual activity by a tree or by an outdoor altar. Even for anything else, like there's no wrong way to do it, but there is actually one wrong way to do it. If you're giving offerings to land spirit and there is a body of water, you don't want to put things directly into that body of water because that would actually be considered in a way polluting the water. You want to give it maybe a little distance away. What people generally say is about 10 meters away would be appropriate. If it's a solid object, then placing it in a body of water is okay. It's just nothing liquid. Like you can't pour anything into it. Otherwise, if you're giving offerings outdoors, which we often do, as long as it's done in a respectful manner, in a reverential manner, then there's no wrong way other than what I just mentioned.
In an ideal world, all belief systems would coexist in peace, harmony, and respect for each other. Unfortunately, as we are all too well aware, that is not the case. Did you, David, anywhere along the way in your spiritual journey connect with a spirit that provided any sort of roadmap to achieve that?
Well, I always tell people in terms of harmony, people getting along together, conflicts will always arise for whatever reason. The way that we would best, even from a spiritual standpoint, get along with each other is one thing that's taught within our own belief systems is that we do things the way we do because not only is that our culture, but that's the culture of our spirits, because spirits have their own cultures as well, and even gods of certain area have their own cultures as well. And so being respectful and recognizing the fact that when we come across spiritual traditions of other cultures, they do things that way because that's what their spirits are doing. That's what their spirits and their gods and their entities, their culture, and how they're used to doing things. And so it's very possible that what is done in one spiritual culture might not be recognized or even maybe acceptable, but usually not recognized in another ones because that their spirits don't recognize that. I think what tends to happen in terms of, intolerance is kind of forcing everyone to do things the same way, which we just see that as very impractical, because I'm not going to try to use North Asian methods to work with non-North Asian spiritual entities because there's no guarantee that they'll even recognize what I'm doing. I might just look like a crazy person to those spirits. Mainly it's having that mentality of recognizing that fact. Actually, when it comes down to me working with clients, let's say, who are from different cultures, and I have to check out to see what things might be going on their side, what their spirits are doing, I have to approach it almost as a visitor, going like greeting that spirit, introducing myself, basically trying to figure out what's going on, and then being very aware and even asking what is appropriate in that spirituality that would not cause offense. And yes, being someone who's living in the US, especially in New York where I live, there's people from every single different culture here. So it does, in a way, and obviously when others come to me, offering hospitality, and when I go to others, being respectful of the way they do things. And I can correct people in the sense of if they want to approach things within the realm of sort of my cultural tradition. But if I'm approaching someone else's cultural tradition, I have to do things their way because that is what their spirits recognize.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy Spirit Voices, The Mysteries and Magic of North Asian Shamans, how can they do that?
They can find it on Amazon pretty easily. If they don't want to go through Amazon, it'd be great to, your local bookstore and ask them to order it for you. I would love to have more copies of this book physically in more bookstores around the world. Or they can go to the publisher's website, which is Wiser Books or Red Wheel Wiser, and they can order it from there as well. Definitely, of the three, Amazon is probably the fastest, but if you were to ask my preference on how people get the book, it's through their local bookstores. It spreads my book physically, and it helps support that local bookstore as well. So,
David Shi, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. I wish you much success with your book and in bringing North Asian shamanism to the forefront.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. To be sure you're amongst the first to receive new interviews when they're released and to have access to previous ones, subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, all you have to do is press the subscribe button on your screen.